This is my Module 4 product. Due to the inevitability of death and its nature to be so shocking to those left behind, three grief-filled yet comforting works, Miss Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Dirge Without Music by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and The Politician, a Netflix original, all come together to demonstrate that while death is a horrible thing and can be life-altering to those still alive, it is fully possible to come to terms with one's own humanity and mortality. The novel I read this unit was Miss Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Throughout her novel, the fear of death plays a large role in many of the relationships between characters, as well as the mental health and inner qualities of all of the characters. Clarissa Dalloway herself has a very hard time with communication and portraying vulnerability to others around her, and that permeates through all of her relationships seen in the novel. And Septimus also has a hard time in his relationship with his wife due to his mental illness. They both just cannot seem to communicate in a way that's healthy for both of them. My first two quotes are both from Chapter 1 of Miss Dalloway, and they are also both about Clarissa. The first one is, "She had the perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day." And the second one is, "Did it matter then," she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, "did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely?" These quotations both show the fear of death in Miss Dalloway herself. She's lived through war, which caused her to believe that every day alive is simply just another day in which she could die, and that's really what makes her so constantly afraid of everything. In the first chapter, she flashes back to a memory of immense fear that something bad was going to happen, and I think that kind of just shows her everyday state. This next slide is about Septimus, but still from the novel Miss Dalloway. Septimus felt the fear of death very prominently and strongly in his life due to being a part of the war and seeing his soldiers die. Yet his desire to die due to his ultimate fear of the world overcame his fright at the thought of death when he resolved to kill himself in hopes that someone would learn a lesson from his passing. "No crime, love," he repeated, fumbling for his card and pencil, when a Skye Terrier snuffed his trousers and he started in an agony of fear. It was turning into a man. He could not watch it happen. It was horrible, terrible to see a dog become a man. At once the dog trotted away. This is from Chapter 4. And it really shows the effects of Septimus's shell shock that he had from the war. He conjured visions, and they terrified him more than the thought of death did. So he was deserted. The whole world was clamoring, kill yourself, for our sakes." Now that he was quite alone, condemned, deserted, as those who are about to die are alone, there was a luxury in it, an isolation full of sublimity, a freedom which the attached can never know. This is also from Chapter 4. This quote shows how he justified his decision to commit suicide. He sees his death not as passing on to the afterlife, but rather escaping from everything that scares him on earth. And his fear of death is real, as most of mankind has an innate fear of dying, but his desire to pass on from his everyday anxieties about life beat out his fear of being dead. The literary criticism I chose was by Susan Bennett Smith, and she tells of Septimus's suicide from a very, very psychological point of view. From the third page, it says, "In Miss Dalloway, Woolf explores the debilitating effects of feminizing and medicalizing grief that leave Septimus without any legitimate means to express his sorrow." And then also on the same page, "Because Septimus has internalized an excess of stoicism in the Great War, he reacts by expressing his grief in self-abnegation. Men, especially soldiers, don't cry. The authoritarian rest cure will not help him. Septimus's own way out is suicide." These quotes show the nature of death and grief to wreak havoc on one's mental state and well-being. He witnessed so much death in the war that he became terrified of living every day, and he had constant flashbacks to not only the death of his fellow soldiers, but those that they were killing, which drove him close to insanity and caused him to see more of a benefit in killing himself than in attempting to feel better with medical assistance. And he saw his death as a lesson to others, which highlights the self-abnegation that Smith sees in the novel. The poem Dirge Without Music by Edna St. Vincent Millay shows an intense reluctance to death. Overall, the author expresses sentiments of grief following the death of a loved one and the idea that they never truly pass on due to the position that they will hold in our hearts forever. She describes the afterlife in a very upset, negative way in order to portray her idea that the afterlife may lead to the forgetting of our loved ones, which is a concept that greatly saddens her. The short quotations, "shutting away of loving hearts in a cold ground," and Down, Down, Down into the Darkness of the Grave both show the way in which Millay perceives the afterlife to be, a place of resentment and grief rather than new life, and more as something lost than new life gained. I am not resigned is used frequently in the poem in order to show how the author refuses to accept the mortality of not only herself but those she loves. And her words, I do not approve, have a similar effect. It seems silly to say about such an inevitable thing as death, but this really just shows how reluctant and disgusted she is at the thought of death. The Netflix original The Politician is a fairly new TV show. It's not fully centered around the idea of death, but it still portrays some very real truths about fear and grief through the public suicide of an early character, River. The death of this character leads to some intense discussions of life and death, as well as very realistic and depressing reactions from his girlfriend, as well as a boy who was in love with him. Immediately following the suicide, Peyton, the boy in love with him, is shown rocking back and forth on the front steps of his lawn, describing the act to police. He was the one who was there when River killed himself, so he's being questioned about it. And he says, I don't know where the gun came from. He just turned away for a moment, and then he had it in his hand, and then he shot himself. And it's in episode 1. His demeanor is very, very anxious and terrified, and that just shows the grief that follows death, and almost like a disbelief that it really did happen. You can see the shock in his face when you watch this episode, and it just really portrays the fear that follows the death of a loved one. All three of these pieces discuss the outcast in society. They represent him with anyone who may feel a fear of death or is physically outcasted and isolated due to the death of a loved one. Oftentimes, grief is enough to push one away from their other living loved ones in order to process their emotion, which pushes them even further away from a sense of reality and life. Those who feel an intense fear of death or mortality may often also push themselves away from others in order to never feel the pain of anyone passing away, which would make them an outcast in today's society. These are my citations. I have Susan Bennett Smith's Literary Criticism, Virginia Woolf's Miss Dalloway, and St. Vincent's Vincent Millay's Dirge Without Music, and Ryan Murphy's The Politician.